All right, guys, let's focus up here. We're finishing up the note sheets from yesterday. So 9.22. Now, what we went over yesterday is finding the lengths of a 30, 60, 90 special right triangle. Now, the side opposite the 30 degrees is called the short side. The side opposite the 60 we call the long side. And the side opposite the 90 degrees we talk about as the hypotenuse, because the side opposite the 90 degrees is always going to be considered the hypotenuse. Now, if we're starting off and given the short side length, to find the others, well, we can find the hypotenuse. We take the short side length, guys, and multiply it by 2. We take the short side length and multiply it by 2. To get the long side length, we take the short side length and multiply it by the square root of 3. And we went over examples of these here when we're given the short side length first. The next type that we had was if we were given the hypotenuse to start with. And if we were given the hypotenuse to start with, we needed to find the length of the short side. And that worked out to be the hypotenuse divided by 2. Because if we take the length of the hypotenuse and divide it by 2, we get the short side, the side opposite 30 degrees. Then to get to the long side, well, we would take the short side length and multiply it by the square root of 3. And really all of this that we did yesterday was revolving around the length of the shortest side length, the side opposite 30 degrees. Because if we were given it from the start, well, we multiply it by 2 to get to the hypotenuse. We multiply it by the square root of 3 to get to the long side. Now, if we were given the hypotenuse to start with, well, we need to get back to the shorter side length. So we would divide it by 2 to get to the short side, and then take that side length and multiply it by the square root of 3 to get to the long. Now, the only other case that we have is that if we were given the longer side, not the hypotenuse, but the longer leg, well, the first thing we would need to get back to is the shorter leg, which would be the longer leg divided by what? The square root of 3. Because what did we do to go from short to longer? We multiplied by the square root of 3. So to go backwards, we would divide. We would do the opposite. And to find the hypotenuse, well, we would take the short side length and multiply it by 2. Any questions on this so far? Okay, now let's look at our first example. Now these here and all the ones that we're looking at today are going to be mainly focused on the setup where we're given the long side length, because that's the only one we didn't cover. So when we look at this here, well, we know that 18 square root of 3 is going to be the long leg. And how do we know that? How do we know 18 square root of 3 is the long leg? Because it's across from the 60 degrees. We can't just assume it because of the square root of 3, but it's because of the fact that it's opposite this angle 60 degrees. So what we need to do is get back to the short side length, which here would be x, because x is the short side length because it's opposite the 30 degrees. Yes. So we take the long measure. So long divided by the square root of 3. Let me write that so it's a little bit better, easier to read. If we take the long leg divided by the square root of 3. Well, in this case here, the long leg is 18 square root of 3. So we would take 18 square root of 3 and divide it by the square root of 3. Now the question is, what is 18 square root of 3 divided by the square root of 3? Square root of 3 divided by the square root of 3 is 1. Anything divided by itself is 1. So really these would simplify out. We could have typed this into the calculator. Use our fraction symbol, 18 second square root of 3 over second square root of 3. Hit enter and it'll tell us that it's 18. The calculator can do it just fine. So this means that the short leg, x, is 18. So now we need to find y, which is our hypotenuse, yes? Yes, because it's the short side times 2. Well, the short side length is 18, and 18 times 2 is 36. So the hypotenuse here is 36. And that's all we would need to do for this here. Any questions on this so far? Are you ready for the next one? Okay. So we do need to solve for x and y. Now 32 square root of 3 is going to be the, which side? Short, long, or hypotenuse? Because we have 60 degrees here, so this is going to be the long side. Because the long side, the long leg, is always opposite the 60 degrees. Hypotenuse is always the biggest. So if they give us the long side first, well, we're going to take the long side and divide it by the square root of 3. So here we're going to take 32 square root of 3 and divide it by square root of 3. And yes, that's going to be 32. Any questions on how we found the value of x? Now to find the hypotenuse, well, we take the short side and multiply it by 2. So y is 64. And that's it. Now what's interesting for the hypotenuse, when it's given in the longest side, we almost do it in this order here, because we find the short and then we find the other. Is for when we're given the long side, or when we're given the hypotenuse, we divide the number given by 2 and take whatever we get and multiply it by the square root of 3. Here, whenever we're given the long side length, like this one here, well, the first thing we would do is what? Huh? Well, here we are given the longer length, yes? Square root of 3 is the longer length. So we need to find the shorter. Well, the shorter is long divided by. So what we're doing here is we're taking by the square root of 3, and we get that x is equal to 15. Now we take what we get and multiply it by 2. Because the hypotenuse is the short side length, which would be 15, and multiplying it by, and 15 times 2 is, that's it. And all of these here that we're using are all for our 30, 60, 90 special right triangles. Any questions on either one of these here? All right, let's look at this next one here. Now 14 is opposite the 60 degrees, so it's still the long side because it's the side opposite 60. So we still need to find the line x, and x would be our short side of the hypotenuse. Well, x is opposite which angle? It would be short, because if they give us the 60 degrees and the right angle, the other one has to be 30. So it's the short side. Well, our short side is going to be the long side length divided by the square root of 3. Well, our long side length, and not the hypotenuse, the long leg, is what? 14 divided by the square root of 3. Well, this one here, we don't have a square root of 3 on top, do we? So we can't just simplify and cross them out. But we can still divide it. So we can bring up the calculator and do 14 over second square root of 3. 14 square root of 3 over 3. And that's it. So here the value of x is 14 square root of 3 over 3. And that would be the short side length. Now we still need to find the value of y. Yes, sir. In a 45, 45, 90, yes. Because the sides opposite congruent angles are going to be congruent. But here, since one of the angles is 30 and the other is 60, they're not going to be the exact same. So they'll be different. But the amounts, if we were to figure this out, 14 squared root of 3 over 3 is a decimal, and we can do that. So here, I can hit this here, and it tells me that it's 8.0829, and it continues on. But 8.08, if we look at this here, is less than 14. It should be the smallest amount, because the side opposite 30 will always be the smallest, and the side opposite 90 will be the biggest. Well, to find the hypotenuse, well, we're going to take the short side length and multiply it by 2. Well, the short side length is 14 square root of 3 over 3, and we need to multiply it by 2. I think it's a little more than 28, what? Square root of 3 over 3. Yep. And if we did in the calculator, we can type it in as 14 second square root 3 over 3, skewed over so we're outside the fraction, times 2, and hit enter, and we get 28 square root 3 over 3. because the 2 will multiply with the numerator, and as we've seen so far, the 2 can't multiply with the square root because it doesn't have a square root. So we're doing 2 times 14, which would give us 28. Now, if we looked at this as a decimal, we get 16.16 going on. And, well, looking back at that here, well, that would be bigger than either one of these here because it is the longest side, is the hypotenuse, because the hypotenuse will always have the biggest value. So these two here are our answers. Questions on either one of these here? And I think we have 2 left, don't we? Because I think we have this one and one more. All right, let's look at this one here together, and then the last one I'm going to let you all do on your own, and I'll come around and check it and make sure you got the right ones. All right? Now, looking at this here, well, still need to find the value of x and the value of y. Now, because they gave us the longest side, we know it because it's opposite the 60 degrees, we need to find the shortest side first. So we're going to take the longest side and divide it by the square root of 3. And what is the longest side length? So we need to figure out what 30 divided by the square root of 3 is. Side scroll. Come on. One more time. 10 square root of 3. Now that seems a little different, doesn't it? Because the last one didn't reduce. Because the last one we had that kind of ugly fraction, yes? Well, this time the numerator is what? 30, yes? What was the last one? 14. Well, is 14 divisible by 3? No. Okay, let's see what we have here. Is 30 divisible by 3? Okay, so that's kind of why it's simplified down to a whole number. Because it's divisible by 3, it would simplify. So that just tells us that x is 10 square root of 3. So that gave us the short side, which helps us because now I can find the hypotenuse, which is going to be taking the short side length and multiplying it by 2. Yes, because we're taking 10 square root of 3 and multiplying it by 2. And 20 times 10 would, not 20, 10 times 2 would be square root of 3. And we end up having these two here. Yes? For here? Yeah, because we can't do 2 times 3 because they both don't have radicals, so we're looking at more at 2 times 10. Because it's almost, we're saying that we have 2 groups of 10 square root of 3. So 10 square root of 3 plus 10 square root of 3. 10 and 10 would be 20. And that's it. Questions on this here? I want you to go on and work on this one here. I'll come around and check it, and if you get it right, you can go on and start on the homework assignment.